All right, everybody, welcome to week 7. This week we're going to be looking at E. E. Cummings, Edna St. Vincent Millay, and Sherwood Anderson. Three incredibly different writers, all part of the modernist movement, um, but doing incredibly different things, right? Because remember, the modernist movement itself, has some set ideas, right? But it really does have to do with a time period, right? Modernism pretty much ends around the start of World War II, and then postmodernism is World War II on, right? And then, a lot of critics argue that aside from literary movements within modernism and postmodernism, that, you know, after modernism, postmodernism is all that exists, right? And obviously that's not totally true. We have genres, subgenres, literary movements, etc. Um, But this week's selection kind of shows the breadth of those differences, right? I mean, while Stevens and Ezra Pound were quite different writers, um, but they're kind of hyper intellectual in a lot of ways and have the same, kind of lofty ideas. We'll see that Cummings is doing something completely different. So in terms of, if you kind of feel like last week was a little heavy in terms of subject matter or philosophical ideas, Cummings is kind of a welcome breath of fresh air. So before we hop into In Just and Oh Sweet Spontaneous, let's talk about Cummings a little bit. E. E. Cummings most likely is most remembered for his kind of gleeful love poems that have this kind of sensuous use of language. And what will stand out most likely, the most clearly for you, is his visual inventiveness, right? Which is a big part of the modernist style, right? Think of Mina Loy's Feminist Manifesto, right, with its use of caps and bolds and underlining to really hammer her point home, right? So it's not like you're just reading an essay. The words or phrases that are supposed to stand out are kind of right there in your face. Um, Now, Cummings wasn't exactly doing that, but as you can see, looking at this piece, it's laid out, its formatting on the page is quite different than anything that we've looked at so far. And that all has to do with movement, which we will talk about in a second. But he was an incredibly innovative writer. He was also a painter, and he borrowed concepts from the world of modernist painting and sculpture to influence his poems. Right, so through his unconventional use of syntax, right, syntax is how you place your words, what order they're in, punctuation, capitalization, and typography. He helped the poetry world think of words and poems as visual objects, which is really important, and a blank page as a canvas, right? Which makes sense because he was also a painter. Um, the poet critic Randall Jarrell wrote of Cummings, "No one else has ever made avant garde experimental poems so attractive to the general and the special reader. Indeed, Cummings combines playful difficulty and willful accessibility in ways that few other 20th century poets have." So, what Jarrell is saying there is that, for the special reader, right, probably being other poets and literary critics, he has a lot going on that's exciting, but also for the general reader, right, everybody else, um, there's something there. So, that, he is a very forward thinking, avant garde, modernist poet that was accessible to everyone, right? So, throughout his work, Cummings wanted to infuse his poetry with a sense of wonder and awe, to incite experience and emotional reactions in readers without any intention to hide secret meanings, right? Experiencing a poem was much more important for him than analyzing or understanding a poem. This seems especially apparent in advice he offered before the staging of one of his plays, advising the audience to relax and give it a chance to strut its stuff. Relax, stop wandering and wondering what it's all about. Like many strange and familiar things, life included, this work isn't about anything, it simply is. Don't try to enjoy it, let it try to enjoy you. Don't try to understand it, let it try to understand you, right? Which is very telling of how Cummings thought about art, right? Um, you know, exposing yourself to art, be it writing, theater, painting, music, etc., um, is a two-way street, right? So, a lot of authors say that for artists in general is once they put their art out into the world, it's no longer theirs, right? Because it's now up for interpretation. And people are going to experience whatever that art may be differently, right? And some artists say that's fine. Some artists have a very clear concept of what you're supposed to get out of their work. But Cummings would very much so be in that latter camp, right? You should be experiencing something and letting the art work with you, and it's going to affect you in a different way. And the way that that affects you then affects the art, right? Also, a very modernist avant garde concept. Um, so, you know, some critics, regardless of kind of heralding what Cummings has done, um, have asked the question whether he's a, in heavy air quotes, serious poet or not, right? Um, but he's experimenting with language, and he's experimenting with language in a way that we haven't seen before. Um, if we think of like Dickinson subtly breaking form, and Whitman, throwing form to the wind with his, incredibly long free verse lines. Um, Cummings is doing something very different, right? If we look at this piece, it's kind of all over the page. But before we get into it, I've said avant-garde a handful of times. I know it's sitting there in front of you, but avant-garde writing in particular often involves playing with language, structure, and syntax, and pushing boundaries of what is deemed acceptable, right? And we can see just from looking at this on the page that he is absolutely playing with structure and syntax for sure. And we'll see how he plays with language as well. So, in just. In just spring, when the world is mud luscious, the little lame balloon man whistles far, and we. And Eddie and Bill come running from marbles and piracies, and it's spring, when the world is puddle wonderful. The queer old balloon man whistles far and wee, and Betty and Isbel come dancing from hopscotch and jump rope, and it's spring, and the goat-footed balloon man whistles far and wee. So, structurally, there's a lot going on here, right? First thing you see, um, line breaks, right? In just spring, right? There are thousands of different interpretations of how people choose to even read this poem, I think, which should say quite a lot about, how different, how people take in art, right? Um, you may have read it completely differently if you read it out loud or if you read it in your head. Or you may have looked at it and be like, what the hell is this? Um, and I think that Cummings would have appreciated all of those responses, right? There is kind of a freewheeling format here. It's absolutely in free verse, right? But our line breaks are all over the place. We have all of these hyphenated compound words that Cummings is creating, right? Mud luscious and puddle wonderful. Um, you know, you can think of a hyphenated compound word kind of in the way that you should think about a semicolon, right? You're connecting these two words um, more than they normally would be, right? You could just write mud luscious without the hyphen, but with the hyphen, it becomes a single word, right? So then you have to consider what that really is. What's so beautiful and luscious about mud, right? Um, how is the world puddle wonderful? So, mud luscious. I mean, we can start with that, right? When the world is mud luscious, why would the world be mud luscious? Well, it's just spring, right? So that means that we have spring rain, right? So everything's wet and thriving and coming back to life again, right? The um, universal symbol of spring, right? Has to do with regeneration and rebirth. And a lot of times writers take that symbol and make it, kind of heavy or heady. And Cummings is playing with it, right? So the idea that spring is supposed to be something to enjoy, something to literally play in, right? Um, we have Eddie and Bill and Betty and Isbel. Again, right? Playing with spacing and structure. So, if you don't have any spacing there, you should read it faster, right? Whistles, far, and we, and Eddie and Bill, right? So it kind of becomes one word, like you're spitting out these names. And Betty and Isbel, right? It has to do with pace and speed and the idea that, after winter comes spring and everything blossoms and comes back to life. And if things come back to life, they should be fun and they should be quick. We have people playing, right? We have kids running um, from marbles and piracies, right? So it's the idea of, they could be playing pirate, right? Or, they could be getting into some trouble and maybe pirating some things. We have Betty and Isbel dancing, right, after playing hopscotch and jump rope. Um, but the one character that is constant in the poem is this um, our balloon man, right? First he's lame, then he's queer, and then he's goat-footed, which is the most interesting description. So if anything changes through this poem, it's this goat man, right? Now, some people have said that the goat-footed aspect at the end is, makes it a little darker, right? Um, and you can take it as you want to. I mean, it's a poem; it's up for interpretation. But it's important that if you're going to that's the whole point of critical analysis and analyzing a poem, right? If you want to take this goat-footed balloon man as a sinister figure, you have to be able to back that up. Now, a lot has been written about this goat-footed balloon man and what he represents, right? We have two interpretations here, but first it's important to point out what an allusion is, right? So in literature, an allusion is a figure of speech that refers to a famous person, place, or historical event, either directly or through implication or innuendo, right? Um, Now, if you have a goat-footed balloon man, the main two interpretations of that have to do with gods of chaos in one way or another, right? So maybe it's Pan, right? The Greek god of nature, right? You know, Pan with his panpipe and his goat legs and his horns. He's a satyr, right? Represents, you know, rebirth and fertility as spring does. So he very much so is a god of springtime and renewal. And then other people have equated that to Satan, right? But more as, you know, not Satan and the devil in the sense of this evil entity that's in a constant battle with God, but really just someone that's there to rile things up, right? You know, it's more of the idea of kind of being a counter, right? I mean, we do see throughout history so many Greek, Roman, Celtic gods, etc., in the Western world kind of equated with Satan just because of the fact that, you know, Christianity is kind of squashing all of these older religions. You know, like we have the Celtic, pan-Celtic god, Cernunnos, right, who normally had deer antlers. Um, and then, you know, iconographically later, those were replaced with horns to kind of equate him as closer to the devil, to something that you should uh, fear. But that's not really the point that Cummings is trying to make here, right? The balloon man, right? I mean, if you're a little kid, someone's passing out balloons, that person is interjecting a little bit more joy and fun and color into your day, right? Um, and of course, if you were to lose a balloon or pop a balloon, right, that can bring about some form of chaos or another. So it's up to you how you want to interpret the goat-footed balloon man. Um, but I would argue that he's there to kind of, you know, be an agent of chaotic joy, right? Um, and then we have, again, our repetition of far and we, right? Which is laid out differently every time we see it. Whistles far and we. Whistles far and we. Whistles far and we, right? So again, the way that we have repetition, but Cummings is changing that repetition um, with his line breaks and his spacing, right? So even though it's repeated, it becomes new in one way or another. And then obviously we have the automatopoeia of we, right? It's going to be the formation of a word from a sound associated with what is named, right? So we, right? Um, so a poem about the joy of the return of spring, right? And it's interesting as well, right? We do have, you know, Eddie and Bill and Betty and Isabel, and they're playing and they're just doing things that little kids do outside when you can finally get out again in the sun and get a little dirty and have fun. But Cummings understands, right, that this is a symbol that has been repeated and written about and discussed for thousands and thousands of years. So he does, you know, toss in this allusion to a goat-footed balloon man, right? So, you know, even though he's doing something new, he is referencing older ideas, right, and symbols. So, kind of in the same vein, um, at least in terms of our relationship to the earth itself, right? I mean, and injust is about spring, right? And seasonal change and how that affects us as people. And Oh Sweet Spontaneous has to do with the everlasting power of the earth itself, and how it always kind of throws a wrench into people's ideas when you try to understand it a little bit too much, right? Again, format wise, everything's kind of all over the page. There is a ton of alliteration in here. Obviously, in terms of poetic devices, we have an incredible amount of enjambment, um, etc. But it is interesting here that, again, even though Cummings is doing something new, he uses language to ground meaning, right? We'll talk about how, we get into these very kind of classical words, thee, thy, thou, right? Um, it almost goes against the grain of what he's doing, um, which is why it works so well, right? He's talking about something very old, but in a new way, which is a very modern idea, right? Modernist idea. O sweet spontaneous earth, how often have the doting fingers of prurient philosophers pinched and poked thee? Has the naughty thumb of science prodded thy beauty? How often have religions taken thee upon their scraggy knees, squeezing and buffeting thee that thou mightest conceive gods? But true to the incomparable couch of death, thy rhythmic lover, thou answerest them only with spring. So there's a lot going on here. Um, and Cummings uses, right, these kind of classical um, words to kind of get his point across. Yet he throws in doting and naughty, right, which almost feels like a finger wag at science for, trying to understand nature and the earth a little too much. Um, but we do get a lot of our answers just in the title, right? Sweet, spontaneous earth, right? Something that is always changing. And whenever, you be a philosopher or a scientist or a theologian, and you try to understand what the earth is up to from a kind of academic, scientific point of view, the earth will always be there to give you a simple yet consistent answer, right? Um, so we have prurient philosophers pinched and poked the earth, right? Prurient meaning having or encouraging an excessive or inappropriate interest in sexual matters, especially the sexual activities and intimate affairs of others, right? So by using prurient, not only is Cummings creating a bit more alliteration, but he's saying quite a bit about these philosophers that pinch and poke and try to figure out the earth, right? There's almost a perversion there. And then we have the naughty scientists, right, that prod at the earth. Um, and from there, we have religions that have taken thee upon their scraggy knees and squeezed and buffeted, which is to hit repeatedly, um, thee that thou mightest conceive gods. So we have these philosophers, scientists, and religions that are taking the earth and trying to figure it out, right? Trying to make it something that arguably Cummings is saying it is not. Um, and then we have, right, we've seen use of parentheses as an aside before with Whitman and when lilacs last in the dooryard bloom. And then we have another closing aside here, right? So, but true to the incomparable couch of death, thy rhythmic lover, thou answerest them only with spring, right? So what Cummings is saying is that we try to take the earth and conceptualize it, right? Or figure it out scientifically, or take it um, and constantly make metaphors and symbols out of it, right? If religions are squeezing and beating gods out of the earth, right? Which we just saw, right? Talking about Satan and talking about Pan in particular, right? We have all of these um, older, you know, pantheonic religions that Pan is the god of spring and fertility, right? If we stick with Greek mythology, there's the story of Persephone and Demeter, and that's why we have seasonal changes. It's all of these people throughout history that have tried to explain the earth in a way that we understand it as human beings, right? But Cummings is saying that, that's not the point. You should just take it for what it is, right? It's rhythmic. It has seasons and tides and, you know, affects everything around us. And it answers all of these people only with spring, right? So, in these two pieces, we can see not only the vast importance of the natural world to Cummings, and especially this, right, universal symbol of spring and its importance and the joy that it brings. And here we have the idea of, people trying to, um, make the earth, uh, break it down into compartments and components that we can understand more. But Cummings says, right, the winter is death. And then how do you explain that everything comes back in the spring, right? That is the earth's answer. Um, so, again, right, um, if the question is if Cummings is a serious poet or not, even though, because he's playing with language and he's playing with form, he's talking about very lofty ideas, right? Um, even though he's interjecting language that almost kind of, has a wink to it, right? A naughty thumb of science. Um, is kind of a almost silly way to phrase that, but he's obviously doing that on purpose, right? Because after that, we have this um, parenthesis aside that really digs into a heavier idea, right? But again, it's something spontaneous. The name of this poem is "Oh Sweet Spontaneous," even though it is the first line. Um, that's what's so beautiful and wonderful and sweet about the earth, right? Is its spontaneity, right? So after it's died and you try to figure it out, ha, and there comes spring, right?